Now here in Exodus chapter 3, the children of Israel had been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And in verse 2, the angel of Yahweh appears to Moses in a flame of fire in the midst, meaning within the bush. Then in verse 4, it says that Yahweh turned and looked, and God called to Moses from the midst of the bush. So question, who's in the burning bush? Now the writer identifies the angel of Yahweh, Yahweh, and God in the bush. Now, is there one person in the bush being identified as Yahweh and given all these titles, meaning that these titles are being used interchangeably to describe one person? Or are there multiple persons in the bush? Well, as we keep reading, notice in verse 5 that God tells Moses to take his sandals off because he's standing on holy ground. Now, I want you to remember this because we'll see this statement again later. And as we continue to read, we see in verse 6 that he identifies himself as the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hides his face because he was afraid to look upon God. So it looks like Moses was also of the understanding that if you see God, you will die. Now, in the next verse, it says that Yahweh says that he has come down to deliver his people out of the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them to the promised land. Now here it is clear that it is Yahweh who delivers his people out of Egypt. Now I want you to remember this because this will also come up again later. And as we continue to read to verse 13, it says that Moses asked God what to say to the children of Israel and what his name is who sent him. And then it says that God says to Moses, I am who I am, and that I am has sent me to you. Now the Hebrew word here for I am means to be, to exist, the existing one, clearly identifying himself as the eternal, uncreated creator who has never created but always existed. He is God. So again, I'll ask you, who's in the bush? Now notice in verse 18, it says that Moses is instructed to say that Yahweh God of the Hebrews has met with them. Now as we continue to read throughout the account in Exodus, in chapter 13, the children of Israel are being led through the wilderness by Yahweh himself, in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now notice in chapter 14, verse 19, it says that the angel of God is in the pillar of cloud. Now in verse 24, it says that Yahweh looks down through the pillar of fire and cloud and ends up destroying the Egyptians and parting the Red Sea. Now it says that Yahweh saved Israel in verse 30. So again, the question is, who is in the pillar of cloud? Now as we continue into chapter 19, Yahweh comes to Moses and gives the children of Israel the covenant on Mount Sinai. Now Yahweh comes down and covers the Mount Sinai with smoke and fire, and Moses went up and was given the law, which he wrote on 2 tables of stone. Now here in chapter 33, it says in verse 9 that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and Yahweh talked with Moses. Now it says in verse 11 that Yahweh spoke to Moses face to face, like one who speaks to a friend. Now, how is it possible that Yahweh is speaking to Moses face to face if no one at any time has seen God? Now again, I want you to remember these things as we continue. As we continue down to verse 18, Moses asks Yahweh to show him his glory. And then Yahweh tells Moses that he cannot see his face because if he sees his face in his full glory, Moses will die. Which again is the understanding from the other examples that we have read earlier, that they were shocked that they could see God and live. But we have seen these examples of God appearing to men, and it even says that Moses speaks to God face to face and he lives. But here, God says that Moses cannot see his face because he will die. So what is going on here? Is there a contradiction? Well, as we keep reading, it says that Yahweh agrees to show Moses his glory, but he instructs where Moses should stand, and that as glory passes by, he will cover him with his hand. And then he'll take his hand away, and Moses will see his back, but not his face. Now, it is clear that this is Yahweh God himself here interacting and appearing to Moses. Now, we also see something interesting being explained for us here. Now, clearly, we cannot see God and live, but we also have many examples so far in Genesis and Exodus where Yahweh God is appearing and interacting with men. Now, here in Exodus chapter 33, we see that to appear and speak to Moses face to face, like one who speaks to a friend, this person of Yahweh is somehow able to lessen or shield his glory so he can appear and interact with men. Now, this is going to be very important, and we'll cover this again when we get to the New Testament, because we will see an explanation of this and which person of Yahweh is here appearing and which person of Yahweh is not. And again, this will help us to explain the statements from the Apostle John, which we looked at earlier. Now in chapter 34, Yahweh again descends from the pillar and stood there and spoke with Moses again. And it says that Yahweh proclaimed the name of Yahweh. Now that's interesting. Now Moses then bows his head and he worships Yahweh. So remember that it's Yahweh that makes the covenant with Moses, and Yahweh is with the children of Israel the entire time in the wilderness. Now here in Numbers chapter 12, we see that Yahweh again comes down in the pillar of cloud, and he speaks with Aaron and Miriam, who's Moses' brother and sister. Now he tells them that he is speaking with Moses face to face, not like how he speaks to others, like in dreams, but that Moses actually sees the form of Yahweh. And in chapter 14, verse 14, it says that Yahweh is seen face to face, and his cloud stands above them, and he goes before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now you can also look up Deuteronomy 31:15 and Nehemiah 9:12 and 19, where it talks about the pillar of cloud and fire. Now remember that Yahweh and the angel of Yahweh are both identified in the pillar of cloud and fire. So either there are two distinct persons, one identified as Yahweh and the other identified as the angel of Yahweh, which we've already seen is also identified as Yahweh himself, or there is only one person being identified interchangeably as Yahweh and the angel of Yahweh. Now either way, remember that it's Yahweh in the pillar of cloud for when we get to the New Testament. Here in Numbers chapter 22, we read in verse 8 that Balaam tells these men to stay the night, and then he will bring a word to them because he speaks with Yahweh. Now in verses 9 through 12, it says that God spoke to Balaam. So it's clear here that the words Yahweh and God are being used interchangeably. Now we also know this is the case because in verse 12, it says that God tells Balaam not to go with the men back to their land. And then in verse 13, it says that Yahweh told him not to go back with them. And as we keep reading down to verse 20, again, Yahweh comes down and tells Balaam to do only what he says, which was not to go with the men. And then in verse 21, it says that Balaam disobeys Yahweh and wakes up and ends up going with the men. Now notice in verse 22, it says that God was angry because he went with them, and then the angel of Yahweh took his stand against him. And in verse 23, it says that the angel of Yahweh stood in the path to block his way and had his sword drawn in his hand. Now we'll talk about this phrase, sword drawn in his hand, a little later on. But at this point, only the donkey could see the angel of Yahweh, and the donkey ends up going off the path to try and go around him. And in verse 24, there was a narrow path, and the angel stood in the way, and the donkey ended up going into the wall and crushing Balaam's foot. Now both times the donkey tries to avoid the angel of Yahweh, and Balaam ends up hitting the donkey. Now as we keep reading in verse 26, it says that the donkey couldn't go around the angel of Yahweh, so he finally just laid down, and of course Balaam hit him again. And in verse 28, it says that Yahweh opened the donkey's mouth, and it actually spoke to Balaam. And then verse 31, it says that Yahweh opened Balaam's eyes, so now he could see the angel of Yahweh. So notice that he then bowed his head and fell flat on his face, which one can only do if Yahweh is there. So here it looks like we have another case where there's a distinction between Yahweh and the angel of Yahweh, and at the same time the angel of Yahweh is identified as Yahweh himself. Now notice earlier that God is identified as Yahweh, and as we keep reading in verse 35, it says that the angel of Yahweh tells Balaam to go with the men, but to only speak the words that I shall speak to you, that you shall speak. So notice that the angel of Yahweh says I, and he's not just an angel representing Yahweh, but it is what the angel of Yahweh speaks. And in verse 38, Balaam tells Balak that only the word that God put into his mouth, that is what he must speak. Now, at the beginning of this chapter, Yahweh is identified as God, and here the angel or messenger of Yahweh is identified as God. So it's pretty clear in this chapter that we have a distinction of persons, both being identified as Yahweh, both are being called God, and also descriptive terms used to identify which person of Yahweh is there on earth interacting with Balaam. Now we see a distinction between Yahweh and the angel of Yahweh, where Yahweh opens his eyes so that Balaam can now see the angel of Yahweh. Then you have the angel of Yahweh identified as Yahweh, where it says that the angel of Yahweh tells Balaam to only speak what he tells him. And then Balaam tells him that he is going to tell them only what Yahweh told him to speak. So we clearly have a plurality of persons within the Godhead. And there's only one God, Yahweh. But we can see that there are distinct persons within the one being of Yahweh, all being identified as Yahweh. As we continue to the book of Judges, in chapter 2, we see that it says that the angel of Yahweh says, I brought you up from Egypt to the land which I had promised. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you, but you have not obeyed me. Now again, compare these verses with the ones we've already covered, and also passages like Exodus chapter 20, where it says, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And many passages that state that it is Yahweh who does this. Now we've read that it is Yahweh who makes the covenant with Abraham and promises to give him the land. And it is Yahweh who makes the covenant with the children of Israel. Now we also read that it is the angel of Yahweh who makes these statements. And we also read that it is the word of Yahweh who makes these statements. So it's clear that the angel or messenger of Yahweh and the word of Yahweh is Yahweh. Notice here in Judges chapter 6, it says that the angel of Yahweh came and sat under the terebinth tree. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to Gideon, and the angel of Yahweh says, Yahweh is with you. Now here, this could either mean that the angel of Yahweh is telling Gideon that I am Yahweh because I'm here with you now. Or it just means that Yahweh is with you in the sense that Yahweh is there for you or supporting you. Now that was verse 11, and in verse 14 it says that Yahweh then turns to him and speaks to him. So either the angel of Yahweh is identified as Yahweh, or there are two persons appearing to Gideon, Yahweh and the angel of Yahweh. Either way, it is clear that Yahweh is there appearing to him under the tree. Now as we keep reading down to verse 17, it says that Gideon says to him, well, who is the him he is speaking to? We know that the angel of Yahweh is there under the tree, and we know that Yahweh is speaking to him. So is Gideon addressing Yahweh or the angel of Yahweh? Well, the answer is yes. Well, in verse 18 it says that Gideon tells him to wait there so he can go and bring him an offering. So clearly Gideon is addressing the angel of Yahweh, who is there appearing to him under the tree. But it says that he is going to go and bring him an offering. Now, is it appropriate for anyone other than Yahweh to accept an offering or a sacrifice? No, it is not. As we keep reading, it says that Gideon goes to prepare a young goat and bread and presents it to him under the tree. So again, the angel of Yahweh is clearly here on earth, appearing and eating. And it is clear that the angel of Yahweh is the one who accepts the sacrifice to Yahweh, clearly identifying him as Yahweh God. Now in verse 20 it says that the angel of God speaks to him. And then in verse 21 it says that the angel of Yahweh. So again, the writer is using the terms angel of God and angel of Yahweh interchangeably. And it says that the angel of Yahweh reaches out his staff and touches the meat and bread, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat. And the angel of Yahweh departed out of his sight. Then Gideon says, Alas, O Lord God. Now notice here that God is in all caps. And without getting too in-depth in the explanation, this is the name Yahweh. And he says that I have seen the angel of Yahweh face to face. Now that's interesting, as we have seen with Hagar, Jacob, and Moses, that they are shocked that they see God face to face. and the idea that they think that they will die if they see God. So again, it's interesting that the angel of Yahweh is being identified as God here. And again, as we keep reading, it says that Yahweh then tells Gideon not to worry and that he shall not die. You have two distinct persons, both being identified as Yahweh God, and one of them given the descriptive title of angel or messenger of Yahweh to distinguish himself from another person identified as Yahweh God. Now also notice this is a very similar situation with Abraham in Genesis chapter 18, where we read that Yahweh appears to him by the terebinth trees, and Abraham goes and prepares a meal for him to eat. And it seems like Gideon might be aware of the situation with Abraham, and he tries to do what Abraham did by offering God a sacrifice. Now keep this in mind as we continue. And if you continue to keep reading down to verse 34, it says that the Spirit of Yahweh came upon Gideon. Now we'll talk more about the Spirit of Yahweh later, but it appears as though the writer is using another descriptive term, the Spirit of Yahweh, just like he uses the descriptive term angel or messenger of Yahweh to talk about another person of Yahweh. But let's continue.